Hello and welcome to Energy Insights. Uh, Welcome to our today's episode that's related to the US strategic petroleum reserves, which is running low. And the question is that can America still handle an oil shock? So, without any further wait, let's proceed towards the description of our today's episode. The United States has one of the world's most important energy security tool, and that's the Strategic Petroleum Reserves, or normally we call it SPR. For decades, it has served as America's emergency oil stockpile, designed to protect the economy when war, geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, or major supply disruptions threaten the global oil market. But today, that safety net is under increasing pressure. The United States strategic petroleum reserves has fallen below 300 million barrels, reaching its lowest level since 1983. And the concern is no longer simply how much oil is left. Experts are increasingly asking more serious question, which is that can the underground storage system itself continue to operate safely and effectively after repeated emergency drawdowns? So, the SPR was built for an energy emergency. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created in the aftermath of the oil shocks of the 1970s. The idea was straightforward. If global oil supplies were suddenly disrupted, the United States would have an emergency stockpile that could be released into the market. The reserves is stored underground in large salt caverns along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. These caverns were selected because salt formation can provide enormous underground storage capacity while offering advantages in terms of the cost, security, and environmental protection. At its peak, the SPR held more than 700 million barrels of the crude oil, but that stockpile has been shrinking dramatically. Thus, from more than 700 million barrels to below 300 million barrels journey. So, the current situation is a result of several major drawdowns. The Biden administration released large volumes from the SPR following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and during the period of elevated energy prices. The reserves subsequently began rebuilding, but the Iran conflict has triggered another major drawdown. According to the recent data, the SPR had around 415 million barrels earlier in the 2026, but by August the inventories had fallen approximately 298.7 million barrels. That means that more than 116 million barrels have been removed from the reserves in just a matter of months. And that's the significant because the SPR has now moved below a psychological and operational threshold that energy experts have been watching closely. So, why 300 million barrels matter? At first glance, 300 million barrels may sound enormous, and it is. But the important question is not simply how many barrels remain. The question is how quickly can those barrels actually be delivered into the market during an emergency. The SPR was designed to respond to major disruption by rapidly withdrawing crude from its underground caverns and moving it through pipeline toward the refineries. But repeated drawdowns place additional stress on the system. The US Government Accountability Office has already highlighted concern about aging infrastructure, including pipelines, pumps, and other equipment needed to move the oil from the reserves. So the SPR is not just an oil inventory; it is an entire physical system, and that system needs to remain operational when the country needs it most. This our point is the hidden problem: salt caverns. This is where the story becomes particularly interesting. The SPR does not store oil in conventional above ground tanks. Much of the crude is stored thousands of feet underground inside massive salt caverns. These caverns are engineered geological structure. Oil occupies the cavern while water can be injected to help push the oil toward extraction system, but repeatedly cycling these caverns, removing oil and replacing it with water and later refilling them can affect the shape and structural characteristics of the salt formation. Experts have warned that repeated drawdowns could increase operational and geological risk. This does not mean that the caverns are about to collapse. That would be an exaggeration, but it does mean that the reserve's physical infrastructure has limitations, particularly after decades of operational and repeated emergency releases. Thus, SPR was not designed for constant use. There's another important issue here. The SPR was created as an emergency insurance policy. It was not intended to function like a conventional commercial ice storage facility that's constantly cycled. But over the last several years, the reserves has experienced repeated and historically large withdrawals. This creates a strategic dilemma. Every barrel released today can help stabilize the market, but every barrel removed also reduces America's ability to respond to the next crisis. And geopolitical risks are not disappearing. The world continues to face risks around the Strait of Hormuz, Middle East conflicts, shipping disruptions, sanctions, and attack on energy infrastructure. So the United States is essentially using part of its emergency insurance while another emergency is still unfolding. Why the Iran war has changed the calculation. The current situation is particularly important because of the scale of the global disruption. The conflict involving Iran has disrupted oil flows and created uncertainty around one of the world's most important energy corridor, which is the Strait of Hormuz. A large share of the global traded oil normally passes through this narrow waterway. When tanker traffic is disrupted, the impact extends far beyond the Middle East. Refineries in Asia, Europe, elsewhere compete for alternative supplies. Shipping costs increase, insurance premium increase, oil prices become more volatile, and governments begin looking for emergency barrels. That's exactly the environment in which the strategic petroleum reserves are supposed to provide protection. But this time, the US reserve is entering the crisis with a much smaller inventory than it had several years ago. So, what does this mean for the oil prices? The SPR does not directly determine the global price of the oil. Oil prices depends on the balance between the global supply and demand. But strategic reserves can influence market expectation. When traders know that major consuming country has hundreds of millions of barrels available for an emergency, they know there's an additional buffer. When the buffer becomes smaller, the market may become more sensitive to supply disruption. Recent reporting has already shown oil prices moving higher as uncertainty surrounding the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz continues. And the US gasoline prices have moved above $4 per barrel per gallon on average in August. If the geopolitical disruption continues for months, the reduced SPR could therefore become an increasingly important factor in the market psychology. America's problem is not just America's problem. There's a broader global implication. The United States is one of the world's largest oil consumers. If Washington has fewer emergency barrels available, it potentially has less flexibility to respond to another major supply shock. And the world is already drawing in emergency stocks. Reuters recently reported that the global oil market is declining with one of the largest supply disruption in decades, raising questions about whether the global inventories are sufficient if the conflict continues for another 6 months. That means governments and the energy companies around the world are watching US inventory level very closely. And then there is China. There's an interesting contrast here. China has spent years building strategic and commercial petroleum inventories. Recent estimates put China's combined oil stocks substantially above the US level. This gives Beijing a significant energy security buffer during the periods of the global market disruption. The difference highlights two very different approaches to energy security. One approach is to maintain large inventories as insurance. The other is to use inventories aggressively during a crisis and then rebuild them later. The question now is whether the US can rebuild the SPR quickly enough. and at reasonable cost once the current crisis eventually eases. Can the SPR be refilled? Technically, yes. But rebuilding hundreds of millions of barrels is not simply a matter of ordering oil. The government must purchase crude. It needs suitable grades of oil. The oil must be transported to the SPR, and the underground storage infrastructure must be capable of receiving and safely storing it. There is also the question of price. If the United States attempt to refill the reserves when oil prices are highly, rebuilding the inventory could become extremely expensive. This creates another strategic challenge. The government wants to buy oil when the prices are relatively low, but geopolitical crises can make these opportunities difficult to predict. The bigger energy security lesson is that the story of the SPR highlights a much larger lesson about energy security. Energy security is not simply about producing more oil. It is about having resilience. That means strategic inventories. It means diversified sources of supply. It means reliable pipeline and ports. It means adequate refinery capacity. It means alternative transportation routes, and increasingly it means reducing dependence on a single fuel or on a single geographical supply corridor. The current crisis demonstrates that even the world's largest economy can face significant vulnerability when critical energy route is disrupted. What should we watch the next? There are several indicators that will be important over the coming months. First, SPR inventory levels. Will the reserves continue falling below 300 million barrels, or will withdrawal slow? Second, the Strait of Hormuz. Any sustained reopening and normalization of the tanker traffic could ease pressure on the global oil markets. Third, oil prices. If Brent crude remains elevated for an extended period, pressure on the consumer and inflation could increase. Fourth, SPR infrastructure. Can the aging caverns, pumps, and pipeline continue supporting large-scale withdrawals and eventually large-scale replenishment? And finally, U.S. energy policy. Will Washington decide that the SPR needs to be rebuilt toward a much higher inventory level? So, on the basis of all these facts and figures, our conclusion is that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created to provide America with an energy security safety net. But after years of large withdrawals, that safety net is becoming thinner. The reserves has now fallen below 300 million barrels, its lowest level since 1983. And the challenge is no longer simply about number of barrels underground. It's also about the infrastructure needed to deliver those barrels during a crisis. The United States still has a huge strategic oil reserve, but its margin for error is becoming smaller. And if the Iran conflict continues to disrupt global oil supplies, the SPR could face one of the most important tests in the history. For the global energy market, the message is clear. Strategic oil reserves are not just a stockpiles, they are national insurance, and insurance becomes most valuable when the crisis is already underway. So this is our today's energy insights. If you found this analysis useful, subscribe to the channel for more insights on the global energy markets and the geopolitical shaping the future of the energy. Thanks for watching Energy Insights. We will see you in the very next episode.